Guardian of the Peaks. The wind bit at Sarah's cheeks, painting them the color of overripe cranberries. Above her, the granite peaks of the Sawtooth Range clawed at the bruised dawn sky. She adjusted the focus on her binoculars, her breath misting against the cold glass. Below, in the frosted meadow, the phantom pack stirred. 3 adults, their gray coats blending seamlessly with the skeletal remains of summer grasses, were circling a patch of thick brush. A low growl, barely audible even through the amplifying lenses, vibrated in the air. Something was wrong. Usually, they were already moving towards the lower valleys in search of elk by this hour. Sarah lowered the binoculars, the image of the wolves momentarily burned onto her retinas. They were tense, agitated, the hair on the back of her neck prickled. For 5 years, she'd been the park's dedicated wolf monitor, learning their rhythms, their territories, their individual personalities. The phantom pack was usually the most predictable of the three she tracked. Her radio crackled to life, the sound jarring in the pristine silence. "Sarah, you out there?" It was Coop, his voice laced with a nervous energy that always seemed to cling to him like cheap cologne. "Yeah, co-op up on observation point. What's up?" "Got another call. Hiker, down near Bridal Veil Falls, claims he saw a whole mess of wolves, acting aggressive, wouldn't let him pass." Sarah frowned. Bridal Veil was on the far western edge of the phantom pack's usual territory, but pack sometimes strayed. "Did he get any pictures, any specifics on how many, what they looked like?" "Just the usual blurry cell phone shot of gray blobs, said there were at least 6, maybe more, scared him half to death, wants us to do something." Coop sighed, the sound heavy with the weight of his responsibilities. "Park's getting crowded, Sarah, people are getting jumpy, you know how it is." "I know," she said, her voice flat. She knew exactly how it was. Fear bred exaggeration, and exaggeration bred hysteria, and hysteria could lead to calls for things she couldn't even bear to think about. "Just thought you should know, keep your eyes peeled, okay, and, maybe carry your sidearm, just in case." The line went dead, leaving Sarah alone again with the wind and the wolves. She pulled her own rifle, a custom-built .30-06, from its scabbard on her all-terrain vehicle. It was a tool, a last resort. She hadn't fired it in anger in years, and she hoped she never would. The wolves were her responsibility, not her enemy. Her grandfather, a grizzled old mountain man who'd practically raised her within these park boundaries, had instilled that in her from a young age. He'd taught her to read the land, to understand the language of the wind and the whispers of the trees, to respect the delicate balance of the ecosystem. He'd shown her the wolves, not as savage beasts to be feared, but as integral parts of the wild, their howls a song in the symphony of the mountains. He'd been a park ranger himself, back when the job was mostly about building trails and fighting fires, but his true passion was conservation, protecting the wilderness from the encroaching tide of civilization. Before he passed, he told her, "This place, Sarah, it ain't just rocks and trees. It's a feeling of freedom, you gotta guard it with everything you got." She'd taken those words to heart. Now, looking through her binoculars again, she focused on a smaller, darker shape emerging from the brush. A pup, limping, its left front leg was bent at an unnatural angle. That explained the pack's agitation. They were protecting their injured young, but if they were injured, why hadn't she noticed it before? She'd been tracking them diligently. Was it a recent injury? And why were they so far west, near Bridal Veil Falls, if they were hampered by an injured pup? Something felt wrong, terribly wrong. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Coop's words echoed in her mind, acting aggressive, wouldn't let him pass. Wolves didn't typically act that way, not without a good reason. Protecting a pup was one thing, but actively preventing hikers from passing, that was unusual, even for the phantom pack. She reached for her radio, intent on calling Coop back, when she saw it, movement. Not in the meadow, but higher up the slope, amongst the stunted pines. A figure, clad in dark clothing, moving with a deliberate stealth that sent a jolt of ice through her veins. He was too far away to identify, but he was carrying something long and thin, something that glinted in the weak sunlight. A rifle, and he was aiming it directly at the wolves, into the restricted zone. Sarah adjusted her pack, the straps a constricting embrace, thermal blanket, first aid kit, rope, a checklist recited internally against the disquiet churning in her stomach. She had to find them, had to understand why they were venturing so close to the park boundaries. The first fat raindrop splattered against her face, cold and insistent. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, turning the leaves into a frenzy of green. Visibility dropped drastically. Sarah pulled the hood of her waterproof jacket tighter, the material rustling against her ears. The storm was no longer a promise. It was a reality. Navigating became increasingly difficult. The trail, already faint, was now disappearing under a growing layer of mud and fallen leaves. Sarah relied on her compass, fighting against the urge to panic. She knew this forest, had patrolled these trails for years, but the storm transformed the familiar landscape into a disorienting maze. Another rumble, closer this time, followed by a blinding flash of light. The air crackled with electricity. Sarah quickened her pace. Desperate to find some kind of shelter, she spotted a rocky overhang in the distance, a potential haven from the worst of the downpour. She was halfway there when it happened that a searing white light filled her vision, followed by an ear-splitting crack that vibrated through her bones. The ground shook. A colossal pine, struck by lightning, exploded into splinters just yards away. The force of the blast knocked Sarah off her feet. She felt a searing pain in her arm, a sharp, agonizing jolt that ripped through her body. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of gray and black. The roar of the storm faded into a distant hum. The smell of ozone filled her nostrils, acrid and burning. Then, everything went silent. She lay motionless on the forest floor, the rain washing over her face, her body limp and unresponsive. The storm raged on, oblivious to the small, insignificant figure lying prone beneath the shattered remnants of the fallen pine. The wolf tracks, now obscured by the torrential downpour, led onward, deeper into the heart of the storm-ravaged woods. The wolves were out there somewhere, and Sarah Walker, the one person who might have been able to help them, was unconscious, at their mercy. Circle of eyes. A low groan escaped Sarah's lips. Her head throbbed, a dull, insistent ache that made her stomach churn. She tried to open her eyes, but the lids felt heavy, glued shut by dried blood. Blinking repeatedly, she gradually coaxed them open, the world swimming into focus in hazy increments. The first thing she registered was the cold that seeped into her bones, a damp chill that had nothing to do with the season. Then came the smell, earthy and musky, overlaid with the metallic tang of blood, likely her own. Finally, the sight. Darkness pressed in, a thick, suffocating blanket punctuated by points of light. She blinked again, and the lights resolved into what they were, eyes, dozens of them, amber, gold, and even a startling, icy blue, all fixed on her with unwavering intensity. Wolves, they were all around her, a silent, watchful circle, their breath puffed out in small, white clouds, visible even in the gloom. The air crackled with an energy that was both terrifying and curious. She lay still, heart hammering against her ribs, trying to assess the situation. Where was she? What had happened? The last thing she remembered was tracking a rogue signal, a malfunctioning transmitter strapped to one of the young wolves. Pain lanced through her left leg, a sharp, burning reminder of something gone wrong. She glanced down, her vision still slightly blurred, and saw the torn fabric of her jeans, matted with blood. A bite, a fall. She couldn't be sure. The silence was unnerving. The wolves simply stood there, unmoving, their gazes unwavering. She could feel the weight of their scrutiny, a palpable pressure that squeezed the air from her lungs. There were pups amongst them, smaller and more hesitant, huddled behind the adults. She recognized a few, ones she'd seen playing near the creek. Then, a shift. A ripple went through the pack. A large, gray wolf detached himself from the circle and moved towards her. Kale. His presence dominated the clearing. He was magnificent, powerful, the very embodiment of wildness. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, his muscles rippling beneath his thick fur. He approached slowly, cautiously, his amber eyes narrowed, studying her with an intelligence that always took her breath away. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. Instead, he lowered his head and sniffed at her gingerly, his nose twitching as he inhaled her scent. The closeness was almost unbearable. She held her breath, fighting the urge to flinch, to scream, to do anything that might trigger a predatory response. His warm breath ghosted across her face, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. He lingered for a moment, his gaze searching hers, and then he stepped back, a low rumble emanating from deep within his chest. Beside the door, her recently serviced rifle leaned, a somber promise against the dimming light, bringing it had been a moral battle, a grim vision of aiming at a wolf. Prudence had ultimately prevailed, better prepared than vulnerable. The atmosphere hummed with pre-storm electricity, the sharp, clean odor of ozone saturated the air. Pines thrashed outside, their whispering needles sharing secrets lost to the wind. A bruised Violet skies seemed to press down, confining the valley, ideal conditions for staying indoors, cradling a warm drink, optimal for ignoring the disquieting reports, the wolves' aberrant behavior, but Sarah couldn't afford to ignore it. A tentative rap echoed on the door. Co-op. He stood on the porch, hat shadowing his brow, a fretful expression deepening the lines around his eyes. Sarah, are you certain about this? That storm is imminent, and that sector's restricted for good reason. I know, Co-op. Her gaze met his, unwavering. Something's amiss. They're not behaving typically. That I need to investigate. He shuffled, his eyes darting toward the darkening heavens. The captain will flay me alive if something befalls you, and you. That area is off limits for a reason, Sarah. Unstable ground, hidden cavities, not to mention what else might roam those woods. What else? Being protective wildlife. A small, reassuring smile touched Sarah's lips. I'm capable, Co-op, and I'll radio in on the hour, every hour, promise. He exhaled, a sound freighted with resignation. Just, be careful, all right, those wolves, something's changed in them. He paused, adding almost reluctantly, and if you uncover anything odd, anything inexplicable, just retreat. Don't become a martyr. Sarah nodded, slinging the rifle across her back. I'm not seeking martyrdom, Co-op, I just want to understand. She descended from the porch onto the slender path bordering the park's edge. The wind intensified, lashing her hair across her face. As she proceeded, the park's familiar sounds waned, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Even the birds sought shelter, silenced by the approaching tempest. The air chilled, a clammy cold that penetrated her to the core. The demarcation of the restricted zone was merely a dilapidated sign, barely readable, warning of potential hazards. Sarah ducked under the sagging barrier, her heart picking up tempo. The environment shifted abruptly, the manicured paths vanished, consumed by rampant overgrowth. Fallen trees lay like bleached skeletons, barricading her way. The terrain became treacherous underfoot, littered with concealed roots and unstable stones. The first heavy raindrops smacked against her face, frigid and weighty. Thunder rumbled distantly, a deep growl mirroring the disquiet in her stomach. She pulled her hood up, accelerating her pace. The trees thickened, their branches weaving a dense, stifling canopy that eclipsed the remaining light. A peculiar odor permeated the air, pungent and metallic, not the usual earthy fragrance of a forest after rainfall. Something different, something wrong. She surveyed the underbrush, her hand instinctively finding the rifle stock. Then she caught sight of it. A fleeting glimpse of movement, a dark form disappearing behind a thorny thicket. Too large for a deer, too graceful for a bear. A wolf. She froze, her breath snagging in her throat. The storm was nearly upon them, the wind shrieking through the trees, the rain descending in torrents, but she remained motionless. She stood transfixed, her senses acutely alert, waiting, listening. The metallic scent intensified, and then, a low growl, closer now. A warning. Sarah knew she was no longer alone out there. Strike of lightning. The mud clung to Sarah's boots like desperate hands, each step a sucking, squelching effort. She knelt, her fingers tracing the distinct print in the earth. Wolf, large, healthy, and heading northwest. The tracks were fresh, likely made within the last few hours. A shiver, not entirely from the damp, ran down her spine. This was it, she was on their trail. The forest canopy, usually a comforting green embrace, now felt like a suffocating ceiling. The air hung thick and heavy, pregnant with rain. A low rumble vibrated through the ground, a promise of the storm to come. Sarah adjusted the pack on her shoulders, its weight a familiar comfort. Binoculars, first aid kit, a thermal blanket, trail mix, essentials for a trek into the wilderness, especially when that wilderness was about to unleash its fury. She moved with practiced ease, her eyes scanning the undergrowth, her ears straining for any sound that wasn't the mournful sigh of the wind. The trees grew denser, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The wolf tracks became more frequent, more confident, suggesting a pack comfortable in its domain. Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at Sarah's resolve. She pushed it down, focusing on the task at hand. It wasn't a growl, not exactly, more like a question. The tension in the clearing remained thick, almost suffocating, but something had shifted. The wolves hadn't attacked, Cale hadn't attacked, they were waiting. Sarah licked her dry lips, her throat raw. She needed to say something, to break the silence, but her voice felt trapped. She swallowed hard, fighting against the pain in her head and the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Cale, she managed, her voice a raspy whisper. What happened? The wolf didn't respond verbally, of course, but he tilted his head slightly, his ears twitching, as if considering her words. The other wolves remained in their circle, their eyes still fixed on her, but the intensity seemed to have lessened, replaced by a cautious curiosity. She was still vulnerable, injured, surrounded, but she wasn't dead, and for now, that was enough. The circle of eyes remained a silent jury assessing her fate. The answer, she suspected, lay with Kale. Echoes of the past. The wind keened through the pines, each gust a frigid herald of her peril. Flat on her back, vulnerable on the forest floor, wolves encircled her. Sarah hadn't felt so exposed since the snare. Back then, the trap had sung a different song, a shrill lament of terror, not hers, but Luna's. The memory of the pup's frantic struggles, a whirlwind of needle teeth and desperate yelps snagged in unforgiving steel, jolted her awake. The coppery tang of blood and primal fear rose unbidden in her throat. She'd stumbled upon her while charting an unassigned quadrant of the park, lured, as always, by the siren call of the unexplored. The pup, barely bigger than a tabby, thrashed against the rusted jaws, her leg a pulped ruin, fueled by a surge of adrenaline. Sarah had worked with clumsy haste, her fingers numb with cold. The trap's release echoed like a rifle shot in the hushed woods. Luna had collapsed, a ragged pant escaping her tiny chest. Ignoring the low growl rumbling within, Sarah had gently probed the wound, grievous, but survivable. She'd cleansed it using scant supplies, binding it tightly with a strip torn from her own shirt. All the while, she felt eyes upon her, unseen sentinels in the undergrowth. The pack. Gratitude wasn't expected, only tolerance. Bandage secured, she backed away slowly, her pulse a frantic drum against her ribs. Luna had hobbled a few feet, then crumpled again. Sarah forced herself to retreat, turning her back on the whimpering creature. It was the hardest departure she'd ever endured. She simply couldn't take her point. 2 dawns later, she'd returned. Luna, spotted from afar, was nestled amongst the pack, moving with a pronounced limp but undeniably alive. A hulking grey wolf, Kale, stood sentinel, his amber gaze narrowed, ever watchful. He hadn't snarled, hadn't threatened, only observed. A silent treaty. ****. That winter, snow fell in a relentless shroud, choking the park in a thick, suffocating blanket. The deer herds thinned, driven southward by the brutal conditions. Sarah knew the wolves were bordering on starvation. The gaunt hollows in their flanks, the desperate gleam in their eyes, spoke volumes. Ignoring park regulations, she'd begun leaving offerings, small portions of her own dwindling rations, supplemented by dried meat bought in town under the pretense it was for her. Incredibly picky dog. She deposited on the fringe of their territory, always shrouded in darkness, always with a furtive glance over her shoulder. She never witnessed their taking it, but each morning, the gift would be gone, the only trace a delicate latticework of paw prints in the snow. Kale, she recalled the way he'd observe her from the shadows of the trees, his expression an enigma, neither menacing nor affable, simply assessing. Now, sprawled helplessly on the frozen ground, the pungent musk of wolf heavy in the air, she clung to those memories, those fleeting instances of, not friendship, per se, but perhaps, respect. Or at least, a grudging recognition of her existence. She prayed, with a fervent, unwavering hope, that those echoes of the past would carry weight in the present, would stay their fangs. She hoped Kale, or one of his brethren, remembered the woman who had aided their pup, the woman who had offered sustenance in their leanest season. A guttural growl, closer now, cleaved through the silence. The air vibrated with tension, her eyelids struggled to stay aloft. Through a fog of pain, she saw him, Kale, looming above her, his breath pluming in the frigid air. His eyes, the same amber pools she remembered, locked onto hers. She couldn't decipher his intent. He appeared wary, calculating. He advanced a step. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut, anticipating the inevitable, but the assault never came. Instead, she felt the warmth of his breath on her face. A tentative nudge, soft and almost hesitant, then, stillness. Only the wind's mournful cry through the pines. The song persisted, a haunting melody of both hope and terror, reverberating through the silent forest. The injured pup. The wolf pack remained a still, hushed circle, neither closing in nor retreating. Sarah's breath caught, a ragged sound against the whisper of the woods. She braced for fangs and fury, yet instead, the lead wolf, his eyes like sharpened stones, nudged her palm. Not a challenge, but a clear communication. Sarah recoiled slightly. The magnificent, silver-streaked creature didn't pursue that. He held his position, gaze unwavering. Then he lifted his muzzle and unleashed a keening cry that resonated through the trees, less a declaration of dominance than an aching lament. A sound steeped in sorrow. A low rumble rippled through the pack, no longer menacing, but laced with what sounded like concern. Survival instincts fought with a growing sense of empathy within Sarah. Something was profoundly amiss. She re-examined the wolves, shifting her focus beyond immediate danger. Her gaze snagged on a young wolf, hobbling noticeably. Matted fur clung to its flank, stained with a dark, glistening substance. Catching the dappled sunlight, training eclipsed fear. Problem first. Is she injured? Sarah's voice trembled. The large wolf, Kale, she recalled from a glimpse of his tag, dipped his head subtly in response. Then he moved toward the limping pup, Luna, glancing back as if imploring Sarah. It was an invitation, a silent request for aid. Sarah swallowed against sudden cottonmouth. She edged closer, hand extended, palm open in a gesture of peace. The wolves tensed, remaining rooted. Luna, the injured pup, whimpered, her brown eyes pools of fear and pain. Sarah knelt slowly, movements measured and unthreatening. The air vibrated with a precarious balance, a fragile truce hanging in the stillness. "Easy, girl," Sarah murmured, her tone gentle. "I won't hurt you." She gently assessed Luna's leg. A deep laceration marred her side, torn flesh visible beneath the clotted fur. The wound looked recent, perhaps from a tumble or skirmish. Infection loomed as a threat. "Okay," Sarah stated, more to center herself than for the pack's benefit. "I can manage this." Rummaging in her pack, she retrieved her first aid kit. The sharp scent of antiseptic sliced the air. She glanced up at Kale, his eyes narrowed, unwavering, but he held his ground. With painstaking care, Sarah cleansed the gash, sterile wipes removing grime and debris. Luna flinched and whined, but endured the ministrations. Sarah's low, soothing murmur accompanied the careful, precise movements of her hands. "Almost there, sweetie, just a little bit longer." The other wolves observed with focused intensity, their eyes tracking her every action. A few edged closer, noses twitching, sampling the unfamiliar medicinal scents. Once clean, Sarah smoothed on antibiotic ointment and secured the wound with a gauze wrap, ensuring it wasn't too tight. As she finished, she brushed a hand lightly over Luna's head. "All done, that should help." Luna tentatively licked Sarah's hand, a gesture of gratitude. Relief surged through Sarah. She had pierced the barrier of fear and mistrust. Kale advanced, sniffing the bandage, then Sarah's hand. This time, something akin to gratitude flickered in his eyes. He nudged her palm again, a gentler, almost affectionate touch. The air, once thick with apprehension, now thinned, replaced by wary curiosity. The pack still encircled her, but their stance had transformed. No longer a threat, they were studying her, evaluating. She had proven herself, she aided one of their own. Sarah knew this was only the dawn of trust. Earning complete acceptance would demand time and devotion, but for this moment, she had taken the first stride, and in the forest's silence, she felt a transition, a subtle understanding that perhaps, just perhaps, she was not their foe. The woods were still, but now, the stillness held no menace. Shelter in the storm. The wind held a banshee's lament, tearing at Sarah's poncho as Kale, the lead wolf, nudged her forward. Jagged rocks, slick with rain, threatened to send her tumbling. She trusted her footing, though, trusted the wolves even more. Their urgency was palpable, a silent language spoken through purposeful strides and the occasional brush of fur against her leg. They weren't just seeking shelter, they were leading her somewhere specific. The world narrowed to a gray blur, the scent of wet earth and pine needles filled her nostrils, laced with something else, a musky, primal odor that spoke of generations of wolves. Then, Kale veered sharply, disappearing into what looked like a solid rock face. For a moment, Sarah hesitated. Was this a trick, a hallucination brought on by the pounding rain and adrenaline? But the other wolves waited patiently, their amber eyes reflecting the storm-tossed sky. Taking a deep breath, she followed. The rock face was an illusion, a cleverly disguised entrance to a cave. The opening was narrow, forcing her to squeeze through, but once inside, the space opened up into a surprisingly large chamber. The wind's fury was muffled here, replaced by the drip, drip, drip of water echoing through the cavern. The air was thick with the smell of damp fur and something else, something wild and ancient. A fire pit, long cold, sat in the center of the chamber. Around it, wolves lay huddled together, their coats glistening in the dim light filtering in from the entrance. Luna, the injured pup, lay nestled between two older females, her breathing shallow and ragged. Sarah knelt beside her, her heart aching. The pup's fur was matted with blood, and a deep gash marred her shoulder. As she examined the wound, she became acutely aware of the wolves watching her. Kale, in particular, fixed her with an unwavering gaze that he wasn't threatening, but there was an intense scrutiny, a silent plea that he needed her help. She rummaged in her pack, pulling out her first aid kit. The wolves remained still as statues as she cleaned the wound with antiseptic wipes, her movements slow and deliberate. She stitched the gash with practiced ease, the needle flashing in the gloom. The pup whimpered softly, but didn't struggle. When she finished, Sarah applied a thick layer of antibiotic ointment and wrapped the shoulder with a bandage. As she worked, Sarah observed the pack dynamics. It was a complex social structure, based on respect and cooperation. The older wolves seemed to command a quiet authority, while the younger ones were playful and energetic, nipping at each other's heels and wrestling in the dirt. They were a family, bound together by something primal and powerful. A connection to this land that she, a mere visitor, could only begin to comprehend. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault. Back in town, Deputy Coop Cooper paced the length of the sheriff's office, his brow furrowed with worry. He tried calling Sarah's cabin a dozen times, but the line was dead. The radio crackled with static and reports of downed trees and flooded roads. "Sheriff's gonna have my hide," he muttered, running a hand through his already disheveled hair. Shouldn't have let her go out there alone. He knew Sarah was capable, resourceful, but even the most experienced ranger couldn't predict the ferocity of this storm. And now, with the added complication of the wolf sightings. He stopped pacing and picked up the radio. "This is Deputy Cooper to dispatch. Need to organize a search party for Ranger Walker, last seen heading towards Blackwood Peak." The dispatcher's voice crackled back, hesitant. "Coop, the roads are, well, they're a mess. Sheriff's ordered everyone to stay put until the worst of it passes." Coop slammed his fist on the desk. "With all due respect, dispatch, Ranger Walker could be in serious trouble. We can't just sit here and wait." He knew he was bordering on insubordination, but he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. Something was wrong. "I'll round up a few volunteers," he said, his voice firm. "Meet me at the trailhead in 30 minutes, tell them to bring chainsaws and warm clothes, and tell them it's sheriff's orders." He hung up the radio, ignoring the dispatcher's sputtering protest. He knew he was bending the rules, but Sarah's safety was paramount. He couldn't just sit idly by while she was out there, alone, in the heart of the storm. A shared dawn. The wind had finally exhausted itself. Sarah crawled out of the cave, blinking against the weak dawn light painting the eastern sky in bruised purples and tentative golds. The air tasted clean, washed of the electric tang of ozone. Kale followed, his gray fur plastered to his frame, but his eyes, those intelligent, ancient eyes, were fixed on her. Behind him, she could just make out the dark shape of Luna, still unconscious. "All right," she said, rubbing the sleep from her face, "let's get you both some help." She pulled her radio from her pack. It crackled to life, and she winced, lowering the volume. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Walker. Do you read?" Static answered her. She adjusted the antenna, a knot of anxiety tightening in her stomach. "Dispatch, this is Ranger Walker. Emergency situation. I repeat, emergency situation." Finally, a voice, thick with static and relief, came back. "Walker, is that you? We've been trying to reach you all night. What's your 20? Sarah rattled off her approximate coordinates, then cut to the chase. "I need immediate medical assistance. I have an injured wolf, possible internal injuries, also requesting backup. I'm accompanied." She hesitated, unsure how to explain the improbable alliance she'd forged by other wolves. The silence on the other end stretched, thick and disbelieving. Then, a hesitant, "Ranger Walker, did you say wolves?" "Affirmative. There, helping. I'll explain when you get here, just hurry." She ended the transmission, the weight of their predicament settling heavy on her shoulders. Explaining this to the park authorities was going to be interesting. Kale nudged her hand with his wet nose. He seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. Sarah stroked his head, the rough fur comforting against her palm. "They're coming," she reassured him, as much for herself as for him. "They'll help Luna." It felt like hours, but the first sign of the rescue party came with the distant whine of an engine that a park service truck, followed by a smaller SUV, lumbered into the clearing. Deputy Dale Cooper, a man whose usual expression hovered somewhere between friendly and slightly bewildered, was the first out of the truck. That he stopped dead, his jaw slack, when he saw the wolves. That he hadn't seen Sarah yet. More focused on the pack surrounding her, Cale stood protectively in front of Luna, his hackles slightly raised, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The other wolves were tense, their eyes darting between the approaching vehicles and Sarah. Coop swallowed hard, his hand instinctively reaching for the holstered sidearm he hoped he wouldn't need. "Sarah, is that you?" he called out, his voice wavering slightly. Sarah stepped forward, holding her hands up, palms open. "Coop, it's me. It's okay. They're with me. They're not going to hurt anyone." Coop squinted, trying to make sense of the scene before him. "Wolves, Sarah? There's a pack of wolves with you. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," she said, keeping her voice calm and steady. "But Luna's injured. She needs help. Can you get a medic over here?" Two paramedics cautiously approached, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and professional concern. They carried a stretcher between them, their movements slow and deliberate, like approaching a bomb about to explode. "All right, folks," Coop said, his voice regaining some of its authority. "Let's just take it easy. We're here to help. No sudden moves." He kept his eyes locked on Cale, trying to project an aura of calm reassurance, even though his own heart was hammering against his ribs. He never imagined his shift would include negotiating with a pack of wolves. "Sarah, can you vouch for these fellas?" "I can," Sarah said firmly. "They want to help Luna just as much as we do. They brought me here." She knelt beside Luna, stroking her fur. "Easy, girl. Help's here." The paramedics exchanged nervous glances, but they approached Luna, their training kicking in. As they began to assess her injuries, Sarah noticed Cale relax, just a fraction. That he seemed to trust her, to believe that she would keep her word. The shared dawn had revealed not just the devastation of the storm, but an unexpected connection, a fragile alliance forged in the face of adversity. But Sarah knew this was just the beginning. Explaining all this to the higher-ups was going to be a battle in itself, and she had a feeling, a deep, unsettling feeling, that this was just the first ripple in a much larger, much more complicated wave. Guardian of the Wild. Dr. Anya Sharma, a woman built like a sturdy oak, approached her work with seasoned expertise. Luna, slumbering under sedation on Sarah's improvised operating table, remained still as Anya meticulously cleaned and sutured the ragged tear in her side. Just beyond the doorway, Cale paced, emitting soft, mournful rumbles that resonated within the cabin's timbers. "She's a fighter," Anya declared, securing the final stitch. "Lost considerable blood, but she'll mend. A hairbreadth deeper, and," she shook her head, leaving the thought unfinished. "You did right by her, Sarah, getting her seen to promptly." Sarah scoured her hands under the trickle of water in the sink, the skin reddening. "Cale deserves the credit that he guided me to her." Her gaze flickered to the wolf, a knot of gratitude mingled with nascent respect tightening in her chest. "Wolves possess an intelligence most underestimate," Anya remarked, packing away her instruments. "Just, vigilance. Infection poses the gravest threat now, and isolate her from the others until she's sound." The pack might read vulnerability as she let the implication hang. Sarah nodded, the hard truth sinking in. Nature's brutal calculus, even within a family. "I will, thank you, Anya." Coop's patrol car crunched on the gravel as he arrived just as Anya departed, a plume of dust swirling behind him. He glanced from Anya to Sarah, his brow etched with concern. "Everything all right? Heard there was trouble." "Luna will recover, co-op thanks to Sarah," Anya said, offering Sarah a knowing smile. "Needs rest and careful attention." Coop's gaze drifted to Sarah, a silent inquiry clouding his expression. That he knew her well enough to suspect trouble was a gross understatement. Sarah simply managed a weary smile and inclined her head towards the cabin. "Come inside. I need to talk." Inside, Coop's eyes widened, taking in the sight of the still unconscious wolf occupying the makeshift table. He raked a hand through his already unruly hair. "Okay, that's quite a sight, Sarah. What in the world is happening?" Sarah recounted the entire episode, from the heinous traps to Luna's injury and the pack's precarious situation. A new intensity colored her words, her voice ringing with fervent conviction. Coop absorbed the details, his initial unease giving way to comprehension. So, you're saying they need our protection? Precisely, Sarah responded, seizing a park map and flattening it on the table. This tract of land, she indicated a vast wooded area along the park's perimeter, serves as their hunting grounds, their nesting site. Securing its designation as a protected zone would offer them a real chance at survival. Coop gnawed on his inner lip, his gaze shuttling between the map and Sarah's resolute face. That's a considerable undertaking, Sarah. The administration won't be thrilled that it entails restrictions, potential setbacks for logging concessions. I know the odds are steep, Coop, Sarah implored. But it's the imperative thing. These wolves, this family, belong here. They're integral to this ecosystem that we can't stand by and watch them vanish. Seeing the fierce determination blazing in her eyes, Coop sighed, an exhalation of reluctant consent that he was likely committing professional suicide, but Sarah's sincerity was undeniable. All right, he conceded, lifting his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'll explore the possibilities, but absolutely no guarantees. Days bled into each other, filled with tireless advocacy, navigating tortuous bureaucratic pathways, and facing the skepticism of superiors. Sarah, with Coop's grudging yet invaluable assistance, built a persuasive case, underscoring the wolves' ecological significance and the devastating repercussions of their disappearance. She even enlisted Anya to provide a supporting scientific evaluation, lending further weight to their argument. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of uphill struggle, they prevailed. The park authorities, influenced by scientific data, public sentiment, which Sarah subtly orchestrated through online communities and local news outlets, and Coop's dogged perseverance, sanctioned the establishment of a protected zone. Weeks later, Sarah stood at the boundary of the newly designated area, the setting sun splashing the forest with golds and crimsons. The air, crisp and invigorating, carried the redolence of pine and damp earth. She observed Kale, leading his pack, emerge from the shadows of the trees. Luna, her limp now scarcely perceptible, strode alongside him. They moved with an elegance and purpose Sarah had never truly appreciated before. They were secure. A surge of emotion coursed through Sarah, relief, elation, and a profound connection to this wild, untamed realm. She was no longer simply a park ranger, imposing rules and regulations. She was a steward, a guardian of this delicate ecosystem, of these magnificent beings. Now, she understood that it wasn't solely about preserving the wilderness. It was about being an intrinsic part of it. As the wolves melted back into the growing darkness, their haunting calls echoing through the woods, Sarah knew her existence had been irrevocably changed. She had discovered her true calling, not within the walls of her cabin or the confines of her duties, but in the raw, vibrant heart of the forest.